Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. A couple orders of business want to get to before we get to the news we're going to be discussing. Remember, TPM we are in the midst of our annual membership drive. So if you are a listener to the podcast, if you are not a member, please consider becoming a member. You can just visit the site talkingpointsmemo.com. You can also check in the show notes for this show. We're going to have that everywhere. Then the other thing is, most of the tickets are sold, but we have a live version of the podcast on April 8th down in Austin, Texas. So thank you to everybody who has already purchased tickets. We're excited to be not just in Texas and Austin for the first time, but really first time in that whole section of the country. So we are excited to see all of you down there. Again, it's on April 8th, so coming up pretty soon. So, and like I said, we have some tickets left. So if you're interested in coming and seeing us, definitely grab some tickets before they are all sold. So, Kate, we've got it's funny. We have Wayne Mullen up on Capitol, up at the Senate today, doing his hearing to be the new Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. It was one of these things when Trump did one of those very Trumpian firings where he just sort of like he posts on Truth Social that here's the new person for the Department of Homeland Security, when for Kristi Noem, you don't even know the old person is done. And I'm not sure she knew she was done when that thing posted, because what is it? She was in the middle of a press conference talking with, I think it was like, some National Association of Sheriffs or something like that. What one thing I remember about that, and it's again very par for the Trumpian moment, is that one of the first headlines I saw about Mullen being nominated, although sort of scare quotes on nominated, was there was sort of like a breaking news alert. I think it was in the New York Times, where they said Trump installs Senator Markwayne Mullen as the new Secretary of Department of Homeland Security. And they said installed because when he first said it, he didn't actually say he was going to nominate him. He said he was just going to become an acting or something like that. So I guess we can be happy for small favors that he actually did nominate him, and today we have the hearing about that. It's one of these things. If you're going to, one of the reasons a president nominates a senator is that they're supposed to be gimmies, right? Senators they not only get, at least in the old days, they not only get confirmed, but they get like 90 votes because it's a club up there and everything. So, Kate, what have we seen so far in these hearings?
Like you said, it's fairly kind of low stakes. Everyone expects Mullen to get through. It has gotten a little more interesting because Rand Paul really hates him. So if he won't vote for him, he needs at least one Democratic vote to get out of committee, though it seems that John Fetterman is willing to provide that. So Paul was really kind of going at him at the beginning of the hearing, particularly because Mullen made some, shitty comment about how he understands why Rand Paul's neighbor who physically attacked him did it. And Paul didn't take very kindly to that. And kind of pushed him on his rage issues and his violence issues. And famously, Mullen had tried to brawl the head of the Teamsters during a hearing, though I guess bygones are bygones there because Sean O'Brien was there, and I guess they're pals now. So, um, but there have been kind of some interesting moments for what is otherwise fairly an uninteresting hearing, including that he was pushed on his comments about Alex Preddy being a deranged individual. And, as is pretty rare for a Trump administration official at this point, he said he, kind of talked out of his ass without understanding the facts. So notable, kind of shows how much water the administration has taken on, from the Pretty and Good killings. And then the other, another interesting thing, he would not commit to not sending ICE to polling places. Little worrying. And then the other kind of item of note is I just like went back and looked at this. We mentioned last episode how Mullen has this like very weird history of making comments that sound like he's a veteran, even though he isn't. And when you go back and look at them, like they're bad. Like he is trying to sound like he went to war. And he made comments on Fox News just recently where he said, if you've been to war, it smells bad, it's loud, like leaving very little room for doubt there. And then Gary Peters today at the hearing kind of was like, and when exactly did you smell war? And he gave this answer, which is so totally bizarre. This is the quote. In 2015, I was asked to train with a very small contingency to go to a certain area, which was scheduled for 2016. He said that this was an official trip during his time in Congress, and it was classified. During that time, I was asked to go through how to meet certain training qualifications. And when he was pushed, like, what does that mean? He said, yeah, it's classified. I can't talk about it. It's classified. And going back over some of these old comments, he seems to be a lot of times talking about, I kind of forgotten this. He went on this like rogue kamikaze trip to try to single-handedly extract Americans from Afghanistan. And everyone was like, don't do that. You have no training. And also, then we have to expend resources on protecting a member of Congress, And but like by all accounts, even then, which he keeps referring to as like, it was an honor to be there serving in Afghanistan. Like the plane never landed because it couldn't get they didn't get permission to land the plane. So they just kind of circled the airport a bit and came back. So I mean, it is bad.
So, and a lot of these are like they're like codels, basically, or kind of like
Right.
solo
Yeah.
codels. I mean um, because that's what I was kind of unclear about. Like, are these basically just? I mean, for our listeners, a codel is a congressional delegation, right? They go, they're always a mix of sort of on a spectrum between junkets and fact-finding missions, and obviously, senators and members of the House go to when we were still involved in Afghanistan, would go to Afghanistan and see stuff, and there's always an element of, they have them there with to wearing flak jackets or bulletproof vests, and look, you're it's certainly not. It is not being in combat, but those places are not totally without danger, even if you're in a protected area. So in most of these cases, again, it sounds like he's just on a codel and doing some uh, you know weird description that kind of for those who aren't paying close attention are going to make it sound like he was like special forces or something. And then this one time that just on his own initiative he decided, oh, I'm going to go in, and but it was sort of like it was a flop because they couldn't even get permission to land. So all right, so they got into this, and then there was these things seem genetically related. Our Hunter Walker had this piece, I believe it was up yesterday, about him, that he also has this legend he's created that he was a big MMA guy, mixed martial arts, and all these kind of cage matches and stuff like this. And as Hunter explained, it's one of these things where there's maybe like each thing has a very very small kernel of truth, that he was sort of like a not an amateur MMA guy, but almost I don't know. You kind of get into it. You do trainings. You find some ringer, whoever who's just sort of in the profession for uh, for wannabes to beat up and say they have a winning. I mean, the guy has a history of being basically a fabulist and a liar and just making up all sorts of stuff. So anyway, so with the Rand Paul thing, is that is this just the two of them have had a gripe for a while, and like a lot of people, uh Mullen said something about that incident where he got in the fight with the neighbor. Is there more than that, or is there a policy angle to this? And in as much as that is that in as much as that Rand Paul is, you know, as still supposedly kind of a big civil libertarian, and maybe he's not going to like stuff that the DHS does.
It seems pretty temperamental, at least in their kind of early exchange. It was just about Mullen's, machismo, and he thrills to violence. And, it seems that Rand Paul is more expressing disdain at his like 15-year-old buffoonery, kind of more than even though, to be fair, Paul has been probably by far the most outspoken Republican, against the ICE hearing we talked about, or the ICE activities. We kind of talked in a previous episode about how he and Peters kind of did that joint hearing with the leaders of ICE and CBP, and actually, showed frame by frame of the killings, and asked them hard questions. Um, it is kind of interesting that I was thinking as you were talking about how Mullen is like apologizing for his stuff about Preddy and kind of backing off. That was probably the easiest to foresee difference there would be between Mullen and Nome, because I don't think anyone expects Mullen to change anything meaningfully about DHS, right? It's kind of the same thing as the administration being like, hey, don't talk about mass deportations anymore. Like, we are going to be doing them, but stop using that phrase.
Right.
But really convenient for them to kind of try to offload the good and pretty baggage onto Nome, and, try to start with a clean slate until they kill the next American citizen.
Well, it does seem like there had already, I can't remember who it was. I guess Gnome even tried to do this to an extent. They have already created this space for themselves where it's sort of given it is understood at this point that people at DHS, based on nothing, and maybe it started with Stephen Miller, based on nothing, went, whole hog on this domestic terrorist. He was pulling a gun, sort of thing that was totally false. And like it feels like they've created that thing already. Oh, well, I was just another victim of that early, kind of false information, and like everybody else. So that was terrible and everything. So it seems like they've, like I said, they he was able to take advantage of the fact that they've already kind of carved out that space, and he was happy to use that space to, I don't know, it's pretty clear that even most Republicans on the Hill at this point know that the accusations against these two deceased victims are not only awful and unlovely and just classless and terrible, but bad politics. They know that it's bad politics, and they know it, and they're trying to, as you said, sort of like with mass deportation, they want to keep it up, but they're realizing that a lot of this stuff, they got so over the top that it became bad news for them. So anything else on the Mullen front? I mean, obviously this is his being confirmed is a foregone conclusion. I think you mentioned earlier that um, if if Rand Paul votes against him, they might need John Fetterman. But in any case, this is a kind of thing that even if they didn't get out of the committee, they would, they'd push it to the floor and whatever. So he's going to get nominated, assuming something unimaginable doesn't come out about him.
Yeah, really the only intrigue that I'm interested in is like how many Democrats vote for him. I mean, to what extent is the norm of easy confirmations for your fellow senators still alive, especially in the face of this, you know, a, a department that's so toxic that we're still in a shutdown over it, right? Like, voting to confirm him while also voting to keep DHS shut down is pretty ideologically murky. It's not really a very clear message at that point. So, you would think it would kind of behoove clear messaging, if nothing else, for them to all vote against him, even if they have to be like, sorry, Markwayne, like politics is politics. I still love you, buddy. So I guess
Yeah,
we'll see.
it's definitely one of these things where you can vote against someone and not be saying they're a terrible person or a child molester or or whatever. Sometimes you fundamentally don't agree with the policy and you just say I'm gonna that is well established ground. So yeah, we'll see on that. I suspect that I do remember what was it? I think it was actually was it Welsh, the senator
Vermont.
from Vermont, right when he was nominated, basically saying like, "Oh yeah, he's a good guy." It's I won't like the. I'm sure I won't like the policies, but he's solid. So that certainly suggested to me, again, someone from a what is now a very liberal state. If he was saying nice things about him, that tells me that you're probably going to have a significant amount of Democrats who end up voting for him. So anyway, we will see about that. And well, let's get into in a way we don't always focus a lot on foreign policy issues, but still it's Iran that is the big driving. I'm not sure you'd say, not exactly a political topic, but news topic in this country. Um, what is your sense of not what people are saying on the record up on Capitol Hill, but do you have a sense of what is the vibe up there among Republicans about, we're 3 weeks in, about this conflict, about what's going on?
Well, we've had our first big kind of MAGA defection in this guy, Joe Kent, leaving the counterterrorism operations and, releasing a public letter saying he couldn't, in good conscience, stay on because there was no imminent threat from Iran. And, he is one of these, you know, conspiracy theory, MAGA guys, right? Like he has a whole thing about the 2020 election was stolen and January 6th was a false flag operation and a rich history of kind of an anti-Semitic through line, which, showed up in this letter as well. Kind of the old America has fallen into the trance of Israel, right? But this is just a divide that we've been really interested in. And I've been waiting to see if it would actually kind of come to be, or if Trump's grip on the party is so firm that the MAGA vein of kind of like isolationism, America first, America only, you could just kind of paper over that division. And the only people really willing to stake out a claim there are like, Thomas Massey and like Marjorie Taylor Greene. So a high profile kind of like in charge of operations defection like this, I think is a fairly big deal, even if this guy is like a well-known kind of kook. He also has a personal stake in this, which I hadn't realized before I read his letter. But his wife was killed by a suicide bomber in Syria
Yep.
during kind of the dregs of that operation. So
The sort of
I'm sure that.
anti-ISIS, like that it's basically that period we're talking about, right? Like in
Right.
2019 or something like that, right?
Yeah, and when things are kind of like, winding down there, and so he has a specific kind of beef feeling like there was no reason for her to be there, especially in this context. So all of that, informing this letter, and Trump's being asked about it and the administration is being asked about it. And I think it's one guy, but it's kind of an important data point because Trump's power is so predicated on lockstep obedience from Republicans. And whenever there are cracks there, that's where we kind of seen him start to twist in the wind to the greatest extent, right? Like that's what Epstein is. Like Epstein was, a handful of Republicans in the House who otherwise love him saying like, no, this is shitty. It just it any break with the orthodoxy on the right is like pretty powerful.
Yeah, I did a post on this. Yes, I have these. I'm not sure they're equivocal feelings. It is an uncanny news story because this isn't just for our listeners. This isn't a case where, oh, here's here's a Trump appointee, and wow, it turns out he's got all these, he's an election denier, and he's like a kind of like a far right white nationalist and stuff like that. This is someone who we've been covering for several congressional cycles. He was a known person before Trump. There's a lot of the kind of penumbra of crazydom around Trump, and there was a big push to get everybody set up with a job when they came in last year, and so that is his place. So there is this, and his uh his statement was, as you said, very much, it was, we only did this because pressure from Israel. And that was, first of all, I don't think anybody who's familiar with any of my writings, anything I've said on this podcast for years, decades, I despise Benjamin Netanyahu. And since he has basically run Israel for now going on 2 decades, that shapes all sorts of Israeli policy. But Israel cannot pressure the United States into doing something like this. It simply does not have that power. And the way that Kent uh, you know described this was, Trump. What could Trump do? He got the squeeze from Israel, and he had to do this. That's not what happened here. And so it's not only is it blaming Israel, and you can blame Israel for all sorts of things. It is exonerating Trump. It wasn't that he just got so pumped about how Venezuela went for him that he wanted to do it again, which is what happened. But it was, it was Israel's fault. I do, but I take your point. It's sort of both, that this guy is a total slime ball. He shouldn't be in this position in the first place. He does have this kind of, powerful personal story. Won't take that away from him. But he's still who he is. But I do wonder the extent to which this will be the first of a number of things. I mean, I saw one article um, in the last few days making the point that you do have this cleavage on Iran among MAGA influencers. The sort of the Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen kind of that part of the that part of the MAGA sphere, but you really don't yet among MAGA voters. They're still, the pollsters are starting now to, when they look at segments of the electorate, often now they'll talk about Republicans and MAGA Republicans. But Trump is still overwhelmingly popular. And one of the things that I have seen pollsters, I think, accurately note is that there has been there's been very little effort by the administration to explain kind of why we're doing this, or have any kind of consistent answer about why this was a good idea, that public support has sort of defaulted to just what you think of Trump, because in a way that's how they've sold it. Why are we doing this? Because Trump said we should do it. And why? That's all that's kind of all you need to know. So I do wonder, and the big I think unknown here is gas prices. There's a big chunk of the American electorate that really doesn't care what's happening in any of these wars. As long as there's no draft and everybody who's over there kind of signed up for it, whatever. But gas prices, I don't have to tell anybody, gas prices have gone up a lot. And I still think that we haven't we haven't come close to seeing the full impact of that, because gas prices are not only what we see, when we fill up our own cars. It has this huge, kind of washover effect that anything that needs to be transported around the United States, so food, right? Everything goes up. So that's kind of what I was wondering about. I'm just kind of curious, how much are elected Republicans, just worried about this? Like, kind of
Well,
whatever
you
they think of the war, just the economic impact.
but you also have the factor that, like everything else, it just doesn't really seem like the gas markets are kind of responding the way that they should be. I mean, this has been such like a through line of the Trump administration that's really hard to figure. Is something like this will happen and you assume like eek, like people are going to get really freaked out. They're going to know just, logistically that you have all these moving pieces now, which is, it's hard to start the stuff back up when it's stopped, that Iran with the strait has a pretty good hand to deal, that they're pretty actively trying to team up with China and box the United States out. And, now we're dependent on Russia, blah, 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 kind of, turtles all the way down situation. And yet prices have gone up, but, I'm not at all an expert on this, but like reading people who are, it seems that they have not yet gone up commensurate with what the conditions on the ground seem. And this just, I mean, kind of same thing when Russia invaded Ukraine. Like we have these kind of wild actions by Trump that you expect to have just, catastrophic economic effects, and then they don't really pan out, and then it just feels like, okay, well, isn't really being punished by the usual weight of economic gravity, and then, it just leads you to a place where you're like, well, is old Donnie gonna wriggle out of this jam once again?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have sort of, two stories at the same time. I mean, one part of it is that oil, a barrel of oil had been in the mid 60s, $60 plus a barrel, going back for a few years, you know, to the after the original Ukraine oil shock kind of wore off. It's been there. Now it's up to about 100, or depending on either different measures. So that's, upwards of doubling in price. That's a pretty, that's a pretty big deal. But it's still only up to, I think that is about where it got in the sort of the initial inflationary surge, the combination of inflationary surge plus the Ukraine invasion that happened, early in Joe Biden's presidency. So on the one hand, it's a huge run up. It's not quite a, catastrophic run up where you're having like, certainly not shortages here. Um, but yes, you do have both those things, and I think there's two. One reason I think is that there have been, over the last 15 or maybe 20 years, there have been a number of crises that the oil markets thought were going to be catastrophic. And there was a huge run up, and people now see in retrospect, well, it didn't actually end up being that big a deal. So, um, I'm going to sort of, buy in the run up, and that kind of holds it down. On the other hand, you do have, I they've denied it, and I suspect this isn't happening, but who knows? That the fact that the price of oil hasn't gone up that much, there are a lot of rumors on Wall Street now that the Treasury has been intervening in those markets, and basically, buying in the futures markets to kind of hold it down. And that would be, you're not supposed to do that. You're certainly not supposed to uh, uh, do it in the way that they would be doing it here. So those questions, or those doubts, are not just from people, kind of resistance people wondering how is Trump, kind of getting semi lucky one more time. There's actual people in the markets who are kind of wondering of like, are are these markets really accurately reflecting people's sense of risk about this? Because it doesn't quite seem like it, even again to very, sophisticated traders who this is their, this is their job. But I don't know. It does it. It is a it's not a it's not a great question. If you're filling your tank, it's certainly a fascinating political question because Trump was already super unpopular before he did this. It's sort of a given, or certainly an assumption, that Republicans are going to be carrying Trump's flag into this midterm, and then he does something like this, which is, the one thing that kind of historically kills presidencies: high gas prices. And this is a case where how much it will how much it will translate into public opinion and people's sense of this. But this is a case of, if you just look at it, like, Trump decided to do this, like, kind of out of nowhere, without anybody thinking this was something anybody was going to do, and just decided to do it. And the results, you can debate the results as a war, but the results in terms of, like, costs and gas prices, like, he did it and it's been a disaster. Like, that shouldn't be something that's going to be great to be carrying into a midterm.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just like becoming more skeptical about if anything matters with him. I mean, and I know we've been over this before, but like it feels like January 6th, like only mattered for like 5 minutes. I don't know. It's just the attention spans are so fleeting. The consequences that we keep expecting keep failing to materialize. Like the conversation we're having about gas prices now was tariffs a few months ago, right? It was
Hmm.
going to
Hmm.
cause crazy upward pressure on prices, and people weren't going to be able to afford groceries, and groceries is something that everyone has to buy, so everyone notices it, and it's
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
huge deal. And price of eggs and whatever, and it's like, did anything really come of that? I don't know. I mean, maybe you can argue that it helped his kind of unpopularity slope, but it's not like we're in unpopularity territory that he's never dipped into before. Like this has become more or less kind of standard issue for Trump. Like this is just the percentage of the country that likes him. So I don't know.
Yeah, I sort of have two minds about this. I mean, on the one hand, we know that refrain, like, does anything matter? Nothing matters. And it's certainly, I mean, you've got so many things. We don't even talk about some, like, really basic things, like, it is not even disputed that his family has, I think, made $3 or $4 billion over the last year. Just in these crypto, a mix of the crypto scams and these ways they're sort of they're these ways that they have provided channels for you, basically, to give bribes to the family through stock purchases of the umbrella company that owns Truth Social, by bidding up the latest you know sort of bespoke crypto coin. So you have these unimaginable levels of corruption that would be the defining story of any other presidency. But when you figure in tariffs and the ICE wilding sprees, and now this war, you're like, oh, how do you almost think of it in news terms, like, where do you fit that on A1, right? Like, there's no room for it. So on the one hand, yes, it seems like nothing matters. On the other hand, he's down somewhere in the high 30s public support now on most of the averages, around 40%, 39, 38, depending on which one you're looking at. um where do we think that unpopularity comes from, right? So I do think these things matter. I guess at a certain level, you just have, say, 35% of the electorate that you just like Trump. You might even for them, nothing really does matter. And in a sense, you said before about how, he's not in new territory for him, but it's pretty bad territory. He's now, I think, uh, it, it, either in or close to in being less popular now than he was at the same point during his first presidency. And the first year and a half of his of term one, was generally seen as the as the unsustainable period, that he's never going to get that popular again because you've had a consolidation of the MAGA Republican Party and stuff like that. So it's kind of both, and I guess to a certain extent, it is it becomes sort of hard to figure because we do have the fact that not at this point in his presidency, but a little later in his presidency, Joe Biden got into similar territory, right? And so I guess for those of us who are observers, you sort of think, well, Joe Biden had the inflation surge. Joe Biden had, all of this sort of the escalating concerns about his health, but he was fairly, he was fairly normal. And so if Trump can do all of this stuff and not be in a dramatically different, public approval space, who knows?
So the last thing we wanted to talk about briefly, we had these Illinois elections last night. Since it's such a blue state, a lot of the interest here was just in the primary races, um, on some topics that will be pressing for Democrats in kind of the every upcoming cycle. But it's funny. I was kind of going over the results this morning, and mighty hard to pull a narrative out of what happened last night, any kind of overarching theme. Like basically every, big money effort got split results. Like you had crypto, you had APAC, you had progressive candidates, and kind of everybody went couple wins, couple losses, not no one, no kind of clear dominant thing. You had two people trying to come back to the house, one won, one lost. It was just there is kind of all over the board. I think the probably the easiest thing you can say is that JB Pritzker is going to be pretty happy with how everything went, largely just because he funneled a lot of his prodigious wealth and political capital behind his former lieutenant governor, who ended up winning a fairly competitive primary for Dick Durbin's seat. So
It's
she's
sort of come
on
from
a glide
behind,
path
like
now.
the
Yeah.
other candidate, who was in the House, dominated money wise, but it wasn't enough.
Hmm.
As I saw, I think this is right. I saw one write up saying this morning that this is an example of, money isn't everything, but you need enough, right? That he dramatically outspent her, or at least significantly outspent her. But it wasn't like that she was on a shoestring. I think Pritzker, um, whether it was, I don't know if it was, kind of literally his money or money that he sort of moved in her direction, kind of gave her about $5 million. So she had enough, and this, uh, I guess Krishnamurti was sort of the more centrist candidate, but like, it, I didn't get there was no sense of like, oh, this is a sort of a Bernie candidate versus a centrist. It wasn't like that. This was you know she won. I guess she ran a better campaign. Uh, who knows? Who knows what those things come down to? As you said, there was the APAC intervened in a number of these House races. As you said, had some wins, had some pretty clear losses. Kind of a bit of a split decision. You've definitely had some storyline coming out of either special elections or primaries that more more traditional, more kind of mainstream candidates getting, beat out by candidates who are, from the progressive wing of the party coming, sort of inspired by Zoran Mamdani or stuff like that. But that really wasn't here, you know. So yeah, there's no clear narrative that you can see, which I guess in a sense was sort of made it different from stuff we've seen in New Jersey and Virginia in the last few months. So who knows?
Yeah, and just the last thing, but even like turnout was high, but it wasn't kind of like record breakingly high. So, you're even kind of deprived of the narrative of like, well, all
Huge
kinds of
enthusiasm.
Democrats are jazzed to vote, It was just kind of a something of a wash at the end of the night.
Yeah, that's to us, true. You have one of the things is you have certainly Virginia. Virginia, it has become a relatively reliable Democratic state, but it's certainly not like a blue state where kind of like at this point it didn't, it wasn't this way even relatively recently. Um, but with the Senate primary, she's going to be the senator. Republicans are it's a very blue state at this point. Virginia's not that way. And so I wonder I wonder the extent to which you don't get the same energy because to a certain extent people in Illinois are Democrats in Illinois are kind of used to not voting that hard. And I don't mean I'm not criticizing Illinois. It's the same thing in California and New York, and these are Democratic states. So, no matter how jazzed you are, no matter how upset you are, if you're anti-Trump, you're not necessarily gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna like crawl over the sleet to get to the polling blocks because these are democratic things and to it there were some there were definitely some ideological fissures in some of these house races, but there was no like kind of anti-ice pro-ice division. Everybody's against ice, everybody's against Trump,
The division in the Senate primary was abolish ICE versus abolish Trump's ICE. So,
right? Well, there was
yeah.
yeah. Well, there was also I saw that you had to. This was when I was watching on Twitter and Blue Sky last night. You had to be very deep in the weeds, but I guess a number of the observers were very upset because I don't know if it was an also ran, but one of the candidates in one of the House races basically was sending out flyers about the other guy saying, "Yeah, he's standing behind ICE. I'm against ICE." But it was totally made up. Like it was totally fake. So they had to sort of, some of the candidates were trying to kind of create a dispute about ICE where one didn't exist. So there weren't really uh, uh, I don't think particularly strong ideological divisions, I guess, that would drive turnout, kind of create that sense of energy. So,
Yeah, and
yeah, go
to
ahead.
just to end on here, so Patty Garcia did win the primary. Our listeners will remember this was Chuy Garcia's chief of staff, who he pulled that shitty thing of not saying he's not running again until the last second, so she can own the seat for free, more or less. Unsurprisingly, she won the primary because she was the only one in it by design. But there are now a handful of, you know, all but a name Democrats who are running as independents in that race. And they have an uphill battle. The signature requirements are much higher for an independent than a candidate aligned with one of the two parties. But, just wanted to say on the record here that I really wish them the best of luck because it was so unbelievably shitty, so disrespectful to their constituents that I really hope one of these other people who has decided to work for the job and not just be gifted it, gets at least puts up a strong enough showing that she has to play some defense, at the very least.
Have you seen has there been any effort that you're aware of to like consolidate around one person? Because obviously, if there's 3 or 4 independents, that's just as good as there being no one for
Right.
her, right?
Yeah, definitely not yet, but, primary just ended, so we'll see. Maybe that's, coming in future days.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay. Just for our listeners, remember we are in the middle of our annual membership drive. If you are a listener to the podcast and you are not a member, please consider signing up and becoming a member. And remember, we have a few tickets left for our live podcast, which is on April 8th in Austin, Texas. And I think that is it for this episode. Anything else?
Nope, see you next week.
See ya.